Hi there, I'm James Whistler and I'm going to give you a demonstration and overview of the Iron Speed Designer IDE or Integrated Development Environment. So let's open up Iron Speed Designer and have a look at a simple application so that we can get a feel for the integrated development environment of Designer and find our way around it. So here we see a typical view that you would be presented with on opening an application within Designer. Over here on the left hand side we have a window called the Application Explorer. Whilst that typically opens on the left-hand side of the product, you can obviously configure it and drop it on either the bottom or the right, or make it floating, very similar in the way that you would if you're working within Visual Studio or another similar IDE. In most cases, it will be shown on the left-hand side of the product. I'm going to leave it over there just so that we're following the normal path and layout of the product to make you familiar with it. In the middle of the view, we have what's shown up here as being the page layout. It's often referred to as the quick layout editor. We'll come back to that in just a moment. This is where you'll probably get stuck into most of the nuts and bolts of what you'll be doing, the work that you'll do in configuring your pages within the product. Over here on the right hand side we have two pop-out tabs, either of which we can pin. One of which is the toolbox, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail in just a moment. The other is the properties dialog. Both of these are context sensitive. The content that will be displayed within them will vary depending on the area or areas that you've selected within the quick layout editor in the middle of the product. So in this case where I've selected cell K2, because that cell is empty, we're not really looking at any property detail, of course, because we're not actually selecting any control area of the page. If I pin those and then remove them out of the way for a moment. At the bottom then, underneath the quick layout editor, we have another section. In here we have four different tabs. Firstly, the formulas tab, the cell editor tab, data sources and code. Again, the content of all four of those tabs is entirely context sensitive and driven by the area that you are selecting within the quick layout editor above it. Once again, at this point I've selected cell K2, which is currently empty. As a result, the formulas tab is showing me that there is nothing selected in which I can interact with the formula. As you may be aware, Iron Speed Designer generates N-tier applications for you. And over here in the left-hand side in the Application Explorer, the way that the nodes are set out in this tree view control are deliberately designed to reflect the different layers of that application. At the very top of that tree view, we have what's known as the presentation layer. That contains all of the ASPX pages within your application, as well as the code behind files and controls code files that sit underneath and behind those pages. Underneath the presentation layer, we have the business layer, where we can include any logic, any business logic rather, that would be pertinent to our application. Underneath the business layer, we have the data access layer. In both the business layer and the data access layer, you'll have one folder for each table, SQL table, that you've included in your application. And again, any code overrides that we wanted to apply to the data access layer, we can apply here and be confident that those changes then, that those customizations will be reflected across our entire application. And at the very bottom of the tree view control, we have the base classes. These are classes which are shipped by default with the Iron Speed product, and those classes operate and sit underneath every other part of your application. Whilst you can see the code that sits within those classes here, they're actually compiled and sit within an external library and an external project to your application. They're there really for reference only. So if I pop open, you can see all the different classes for interrogating table data, for example. The little lock symbol up here is denoting to you that whilst you can see this code here, you're not at liberty to change it at this point. Let's go back now into the presentation layer within our Application Explorer and look at one of the pages so that we can get an understanding of the quick layout editor and the page structure. So the quick layout editor is this section that we're seeing in here in the middle. And the way that this is laid out like a standard grid or spreadsheet style view. The important part of that is to understand the three-dimensional nature of what the Quick Layout Editor is attempting to provide us with. So when looking at your Quick Layout Editor, always be aware of this drop-down control above it and try to get an understanding of how the two of these fit together. So at the moment, what we're looking at in the Quick Layout Editor, these cells within our spreadsheet, actually exist within the Categories Fields section of this page, which is effectively at the bottom level of that hierarchy that you can see within that drop-down control. If we go to the top of that drop-down control, we have the master page, the ASP master page definition that this particular page is utilizing. I'm not going to go to that at this point, but I'm going to go to the top level of the Show Categories Table ASPX page. You can see that that name there that I've highlighted is also the same name as being reflected in the Application Explorer to the left of the Quick Layout Editor. So that effectively is the top level of the hierarchy, if you like, of this Show Categories Table page. So if I click through to there, you'll see that the section highlighted now in the page section drop down at the top there has changed, of course. And now when I look there, I can see all of the content that actually exists in terms of the control structure within or on the Show Categories Table ASPX page. And all we really have on this simple page is one table control, unsurprisingly containing categories. The fact that this cell, or the content of this cell A1, the table control is shown with an underscore or an underline, indicates to me a little bit like a hyperlink that I can click through into that control. I can drill down, if you like, within the three-dimensional nature of this page into lower levels of control and lower levels of the hierarchy of that page. So if I double click into Categories Table Control, you'll see, of course, the page section at the top has changed, and then underneath there I can now see I've got a Categories Panel header, and then within a collapsible region I have the Categories panel. When I pop open this drop down, you'll see that that is then also reflected within the hierarchy of that drop down control there. So that, obviously it's a very quick kind of example of how to run through that, but as you work your way through the different levels of the hierarchy of the page here, the Quick Layout Editor its content will change dynamically to reflect the content of that level of the page. So let's go back to Categories Fields where we came in, and we can see here the actual fields and labels that are going to be displayed within that category, the table of category data that's going to be presented to the user. So let's have a little bit of a look now at the context sensitive nature of the individual cells within the Quick Layout Editor. At this point, I've selected cell F1. That's within the heading section of the categories table. And at this point, I've selected the category name label. So this is the heading, if you like, which is going to sit above the category name column of data. And in cell F2, within the table row, that's where the category name would be displayed. Underneath then the Quick Layout Editor down here, I've got the four tabs which I referred to briefly earlier. The first of which is the Formulas tab. So you can see here that as we select the category name field in cell F2, the formula that's reflected in there is showing us how and where that data is going to be populated from the category record. I could, for example, select this, and by right-clicking in here, I could pick alternative fields from the category table that I actually wanted to be displayed and bound to that literal that's going to be shown in the Show Categories table page. Depending on the nature of the page I was interacting with, if it were an add record page or possibly an edit table or something of that nature where I was changing data, the category name may well be a text box. And in that case, I would be able to apply formulas to it. So I could override the various validate methods using the Formulas tab. I could choose whether to alternatively save that value entered into the database field or into a session variable or a cookie, for example, as you can see from the Formulas dialog there. The important point to remember, of course, is that that Formulas tab that's being displayed underneath is entirely context sensitive. As I move around the Quick Layout Editor above, you'll see that the content of that formula tab is changing dynamically to reflect the nature of the control that I'm interacting with above in the Quick Layout Editor. That's also true when we move to the next tab, the Cell Editor. Here we're looking at what's actually within the cell F1, and at the moment you can see all I have is a gen tag denoting the fact that we want to generate code in order to display the category name, label or heading. I've got a number of different controls available to me here which look a little bit like controls that you'd see within a text editor of any other type that was, let's call it a WYSIWYG editor. The important point to remember here is that what you're editing within this cell is not strictly a WYSIWYG editor. Rather, this editor and the controls that you have at your disposal are going to generate HTML within that cell to achieve the effect that you desire. So at this point, I've selected the category name label. If I were to click on B for bolding, rather than this content becoming emboldened, you'll see that what Designer's actually done is include bold tags around my label, which would produce the desired result. So it's not strictly a WYSIWYG editor, but it does enable us using those common kind of WYSIWYG controls to achieve the same effect. To the right of the cell editor, I've then got data sources. Now, depending on where I've come into the data sources tab, this may or may not be entirely context sensitive, but regardless of that, in the left-hand side here, all of the different queries that run underneath this page, so querying the SQL database, all of them will be displayed to you, and you can, by clicking on those, you can see the SQL in the right-hand side of the control, which is showing you effectively what SQL statement is being run against the database in order to retrieve data. You might well ask, in this case, well, as you understood it, all that we're looking at on this page is the categories table. So here we've got the query that's pulling data from the categories table. If that's the case, why do we have two other queries? Well, those exist because at the same time on this page we have a filters section, which enables us to filter the data displayed in the categories table control. And by selecting the filters that are in there, you'll see that we've got a filter on the category name. At this point, of course, my context-sensitive nature of the data sources tab becomes evident. When I click the category name filter control at the top in cell B2, you'll see that the data source for category name filter is pre-selected for me below. Likewise, when I select the article path filter, you'll see that that particular data source is automatically highlighted for me in the data sources. You do have the ability to amend those data sources using the edit button down here. Doing so is somewhat outside of the scope of this particular video, so I'm not going to go through that at this point. But suffice to say, you can apply simple customizations to those queries by editing them directly here. Then further to the right along here, we have the Code tab. On the Code tab, again, this is highly context sensitive. Depending on where we are within our application, the commonly overridden code methods associated with the control you've selected will be shown on the left-hand side. Where they're shown without bold text being applied, that's indicating that they have not been overridden or customized. So, for example, if I were to override the populate method, and I'll just put a little comment in here. At that point that I've applied my override, you'll see that the populate method is now shown in bold text. That's to indicate that the code within that populate method has been overridden. And as soon as I see that, there's my override, shown highlighted. You'll then see that this restore button becomes available. And that's going to restore with the code method, whichever one it might be that we've selected on the left-hand side, back to its original state. Click that and confirm, and you'll see that that code disappears. So those are the code tab, or rather those are all of the tabs relating to the Quick Layout Editor above. Hopefully that's given you a little bit of an overview also of how they are context driven and the selection that you're making in the quick layout editor above is important. Let's now take a look at the two folded away tabs that we have on the right hand side of the IDE, the toolbox and properties tabs. Looking firstly at properties, we pop this open. You're probably becoming rather tired of me hearing about the context sensitive nature of the quick layout editor, but once again the properties dialog, which is shown on the right hand side, is entirely context sensitive. Something that's worth pointing out at this point, that the properties dialog now gives you access not only to the Iron Speed Designer specific properties of any control that you've selected, but also the wider ASP.NET properties as well. Those are distinguished on the right hand side here by the presence or otherwise of square brackets. So at the top here we've got application generation properties relating to the article path filter. The fact that that's shown designated to us within square brackets indicates that the properties within that section are Iron Speed Designer specific properties. So the accessibility, appearance, behavior, data, layout and miscellaneous properties underneath are generic ASP.NET properties which you would typically find associated with a drop-down control. So they are not specific to Iron Speed Designer. That makes it a much more powerful tool for you, of course. Prevents you needing to keep chopping backwards and forwards to Visual Studio to get access to those properties and be able to easily override them. And hopefully makes a kind of similar design and consistency with Visual Studio, which will aid you in your development. So popping properties out of the way for a moment, we also have the toolbox dialog. Now whilst this is still once again context sensitive, it is to a lesser extent so. Within here we've got a number of different, it's almost like an accordion control. We've got a number of different sections available. So we can drag headers and footers onto our page as well as menus. We can drag alternative or additional data controls. So we can pick record controls, table controls, etc. from these sections on the right hand side. Anything that's specifically related to the data that we're looking at over on the left within the quick layout editor will be shown automatically for us here. The fact that Iron Speed Designer is aware of a foreign key relationship between categories table and the products table would enable me to drag on a products table, for example, and Iron Speed Design would automatically generate all of the binding to relate that to the category above. In addition to that, we'd also then see unrelated tables on the right hand side. There's nothing to prevent us from dragging and dropping those onto the page, but clearly if there is no foreign key relationship in existence between the data that we're already looking at and those tables, none would be automatically generated. We might have to go and bind that in manually if indeed anything did exist. Underneath there we can drag charts onto our page. So that's to give us any kind of graphical representation of or summary of data. We can look at the individual fields and labels which relate to the table that we're already interrogating. So here we can see the fields that are being shown as belonging to the categories table from the SQL definition. We've similarly got the labels which are associated with each of those fields, as well as various different mathematical functions and totaling. We could drag on additional filters, not necessarily just based on the categories table, but conceivably based on other tables within the application, as well as a generic search filter. Depending on the nature of again, where we are on the page and what type of page this is, we could drag and drop on generic button types. So in this case, the only button automatically available to us is the search button, or the go button from the search page. If we were looking at an edit page, for example, we might have save and cancel buttons automatically available to us there. Once we drag and drop those onto the page, Designer will generate automatically all of the code required to wire them in and make them functional. And then if you're really looking to extend your application, within the bottom control within that toolbox, you can drop onto there the entire suite of Ajax Control Toolkit members. The Ajax Control Toolkit is now bound directly in as a DLL into your Iron Speed Designer generated app. There's no need to hardwire that yourself. And that then gives you access to all of these additional controls, which you can drop and configure directly within your application. So let's pop the toolbox back out of the way. And then moving back, just the last thing I wanted to show you in this video is the location of the code files behind your pages, as well as the CSS definitions which exist within your application. So looking at CSS first, whenever you generate an Iron Speed Designer application, you will be presented with a folder called App Themes. And within there, you will have an individual folder for each of the themes that you've selected in your application. The reason I say each of the themes is that some of them are runtime configurable. So if you were to go, for example, with, I believe it's Himalaya or possibly Appalachian, each of the runtime configurable themes that exist within those wider generic themes would have a folder contained within here. We pop that open. There are then two files available to you in there, the base styles and styles CSS files. The styles file will always be generated for you empty, and that's where you should place any customizations that you want to make to the CSS of your application. When your application runs, your app will always interrogate the styles file first to look for any CSS class definition before looking to the base styles file for that definition. So any customization that you make in styles will always be picked up first. So in addition to CSS files that are then located within the presentation layer in your app, you will of course also have all of the code files. Depending on whether you've generated a website or a web application, they will either be placed for both the code behind and controls code files. They will either both be available to you underneath the page itself or within a separate app code folder. In this case, we can see here we've got the code behind file for the show categories table page, the controls code file for that same page, because of, I believe in this case we've generated a website, would then be held in the app code folder, again within the categories page, or categories folder rather. So all of the code at page level that you would have generated within your application is still held within the presentation layer, which you can access within the Application Explorer on the left-hand side. I hope that's given you a quick kind of run through the IDE of Iron Speed Designer. There are clearly lots of other videos available for you to find more detailed information about the different areas within the product. Thank you very much for watching.